Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. We're about to get started. Please find a seat. We're delighted to have you all with us. We're very glad to have a number of organizations working together to present this evening. Muslims Facing Tomorrow, we're the generators of the idea. We're also happy to present with the Free Thinking Film Society. And we have some friends from Just Right Media who are recording the event, which means it will be available on YouTube or on social media platforms for people to enjoy afterwards. My name is Miles Smit. I serve alongside Shirley Ann Haber, who's the president of the Speakers Action Group, and I will moderate this evening. I will not be saying much. I will just be the person in between speakers to ensure that we have a courteous conversation where one person is talking at a time. We're very pleased to have a diverse panel with us tonight, and their purpose is to get the conversation started. This is the first of what we hope will be a series of collaborative public conversations of this kind, where we will hear from people who are versed in issues, and then, as important or more important, we'll hear from the public. So we're going to have a conversation where many people will have a chance to speak, but only one person will be speaking at a time. What I will be doing is using the clock that you see to your right and your left, and people will be invited to speak for a period of time, and then the time will be up, and we'll reset and we'll move on to the next person. Each of the panelists, moving from my right, your left, to the other direction, will speak for 5 minutes each. Then we'll have a short moderated conversation where we go over some of the issues that people have exchanged and teased out, and then, very importantly, we want to hear from you. At some events, they only ask for questions. This is one event where actually a comment or a question is equally welcome. We know that it will be courteous and on topic. And of course, just like the panelists, there is a time constraint. So we ask you to keep your question or your remarks to a minute, and then that will leave a couple of minutes for one or more of the panelists to answer, and that will allow us to take the maximum number of questions from the floor. People will be trickling in through the evening. We have effectively a sellout crowd scheduled for the evening, so there will be a lot of people to hear from, and that's why we're managing our time so carefully. Before we get started with the substance of the campaign, this is an evening in which we talk about civics, the kind of discussion that you only have in a free society. This conversation would not be happening in North Korea. It would not easily be happening in Iran. It would not easily be happening in a country like Cuba. But Canada is a free society, and that means that there are civic questions, and the civil society has to deliberate what issues are most important and how those issues should be addressed. And a friend of ours, Reva Stern, who is a member of our board at Speakers Action Group and is also the chair of Amen Forever, has an exciting new initiative to tell us about that touches on the issue of civics. And we look forward to hearing from her.
Thank you, Miles. Thank you, everyone. Good evening. We have a very exciting conversation to get to tonight, so I won't keep you long. The announcement I'm privileged to make tonight might also be considered a kind of conversation. In this 21st century, we have more access to tools of communication than ever before in the history of mankind, and we use them to the max every minute of every day through social media, and yet we understand and trust each other far less than ever in history. Look around you in a restaurant, on the subway, on the street, and sadly even in cars, often while driving. Our kids do it, their parents do it, and their parents too. There seems to be a lot to say about a little. We thought it would be a good idea to offer kids from the age of 16 to 22 an opportunity to say a lot about a lot. And that's why tonight, Amen Forever, in association with the Speakers Action Group, are launching our first annual Envision Your World Writing Challenge. We want our kids to observe our world and communicate what they see, feel, think, fear, or love about it. Kids have fertile imaginations that are fed a steady diet of images, from the joys of cat videos to a multitude of viral videos about stupid people tricks that elicit hilarity at the expense of the injured parties. And worst of all, they are exposed to vivid glimpses into the horrors of terrorism and genocide and the unavoidable natural disasters that TV news relishes in replaying over and over to fill a 24/7 information loop. But the issue that most affects our kids personally is the demonic plague of bullying, racism, and anti-Semitism. So this year's $500 award for the best fiction, nonfiction, or creative nonfiction will go to the young writer who presents the most outstanding story on the topic, bullies, racists, and political correctness. We'll be handing out brochures at the door on your way out, and I hope you'll take one and spread the word. We want to hear what our kids have to say, and we offer them an opportunity to say it in more than 140 characters. In fact, in 800 to 1,200 words. Please take a brochure home with you and encourage some young aspiring writer you know to think about the topic and put those thoughts on paper. Who knows? Once they get excited about writing, maybe they'll even be inspired to read Tolstoy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Riva. We'll move on to the substance of the evening's discussion. We have a topical subject this evening as legislature that relates to is being discussed, and the general public is coming to grips with a challenge that faces, as we said a minute ago, a free society. Unlike a dictatorship or a police state, we have principles of both security and liberty as pillars of our society. Those are two things, among other axioms, which allow us to live the way we do. A vibrant economy, a free exchange of ideas, the free movement, the free action of peoples. So before we go to our 6 panelists, we selected a couple of excerpts from the public debate that are topical that we think will help frame some of the remarks we're going to hear. And we're going to watch, in the first instance, an extremely short video clip, a very short clip, and we'll then see a quote on a slide, and those represent perhaps, so to speak, the north and the south pole of the opinions that are in play. And we're going to hear in far more granularity from our panelists for 5 minutes each after that.
Martin on this. Louise, what did the sister say?
Well, she is urging support of this, urging MPs and senators to pass the legislation because she says it would allow police and government agencies to have the power to share more information and to get ahead. She also suggests if that new law was in place, the RCMP would have been able to detain the man who killed her brother. Take a listen to Louise Vincent.
It doesn't touch only a family, it doesn't touch only a province, it touched the whole Canada, it touched the world. So this, CC51, is important. Il ne faut pas que Patrice Vincent soit mort en vain.
Patrice Vincent must not have died in vain.
There would have been more proof, and the requirement for the level of proof would have been smaller because now they have to say the person will commit the crime, will do terrorism, will create that issue. Now they say might. We're not going to lose our liberty and power of expression. We're not. People start to be afraid of that for nothing.
Louise Vincent went on to say that under the new laws, that family and friends of Rouleau would have been able to warn police and prepare more material for the RCMP that could have been able to allow them to issue a warrant for his arrest.
And with a different perspective, I think we have a slide with a quote. There we go. So why, in the light of multiple recent arrests under anti-terror laws, is it necessary to add to those laws when the existing criminal framework is proving itself able to catch and stop terrorists before they commit crimes? That is not a question that has been answered convincingly by the government and the supporters of the bill. So there you have it. The question of what needs to be done and by whom, the balance of coercion and persuasion, and of course the classic balance between preventive and after-the-fact law enforcement. Our first speaker, and again, you can find the bios for all these tremendous people to my right and my left in your booklet, in your brochure, is Professor Salim Mansur. Salim, for 5 minutes.
Am I on? Well, thank you. I want to begin by thanking the organizers of this event, in particular Shirley Ann Haber, Miles Smit, and Riva Stern, for putting this together. It sure takes a lot of commitment and work, and it would not happen without them. So we all owe them thanks for bringing us together for this public conversation on a subject that is timely, important, and urgent. I heard in person Madame Louis Winson at the parliamentary hearing over Bill C-51 in Ottawa, when she was one of the invited witnesses, which you saw the clip now, testifying before the Commons Committee. She mentioned that if the measure Bill C-51 proposes were in place last fall, her brother, Warrant Officer Patrice Winson of the Canadian Armed Forces, would not likely have been killed by a Quebecois convert to Islamist jihadism outside of Montreal. These words, so simply stated, left an electrifying effect on all present in the chamber. The subject on hand, however, goes beyond the parliamentary debate over Bill C-51, since such debates are heavily partisan due to the very nature of partisan politics in our legislatures. Bill C-51 or other similar legislation is a response by elected representatives in an open, liberal, democratic society such as ours to meet threats the society apprehends, anticipates, or happens to be confronted with from within or from outside, or both. The larger issue, and it is one I suggest that is insufficiently addressed or understood, is the relationship between liberty and security in an open, liberal, democratic society. By the way, only a liberal democracy can be truly an open society, and vice versa. It is only in an open society that politics of the left and right and all shades in between are present. In a closed society, again, whether of the left or the right, or under any other authoritarian or worse, totalitarian regime, such as, for example, Miles mentioned, the Islamic Republic of Iran or the People's Republic of China, there is no room for any sort of dissident perspective to be heard or influence the imperatives of those holding power. Now back to the relationship between liberty and security. It has been understood by just about all political philosophers in advancing the ideas of open society and in defending them that there can be no liberty, hence individual freedom as enunciated in our Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom, without security. In other words, only in an open, liberal, democratic society that is secure, that is cognizant of a social contract resting upon means available to protect it, that freedom can flourish. Absent the one, in other words, weaken or ignore the requirements of security, and it will follow that there will be weakening or loss of freedom of individuals in that society. It is not the other way around. And history more or less provides lesson that where liberty is left vulnerable to those forces within society or from outside that prey upon it, that is intolerant or ideologically opposed to the very idea of individual freedom, in such places, liberty is invariably endangered or lost. We are at present time witnessing how anarchy, discord, and religious sectarian conflicts have made a travesty for those across the Middle East and North Africa who raised the issue of liberty a few years ago without adequate thoughts given to security. What this means for us in our conversation here this evening and in our homes and schools and at workplace is to become aware, and the more the better, of the intimate connection between liberty and security in our open society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A great opening salvo. And our next speaker is someone who, as a criminal defense attorney, understands very well the principle that our laws exist to protect the unpopular, those who are under suspicion, as well as to provide security. There's a famous quote from Malcolm X that you cannot have an intelligent society without policing, but there are obviously a great need for checks on that. And so Leo Adler is as capable as anyone to tell us about that perspective and others.
Thank you. And so let me tell you where I'm coming from in my personal perspective. And I begin with my grandfather, who I'm named after. He was a Berliner. And when Hitler came to power, his three brothers said, "It's time to get out." He said, it's just politics. They only talk, they don't do anything. On the second night of Rosh Hashanah, exactly 2 weeks after World War II started, he and others were forced to dig their own grave, and they were shot. So when someone says that they're coming after us, I believe them. Canada has a history of terrorism. On April the 7th, 1868, D'Arcy McGee, who was one of the fathers of Confederation, a former Fenian, a terrorist, who had denounced terrorism, was assassinated. Ever since then, there have been an endless series of smaller but still acts of terrorism. We may remember Air India in 1985, and some of us may even remember the FLQ crisis of 1970. I remember it because the War Measures Act was called out, and I remember it because there was a warrant issued for my arrest because of groups that I had been hanging around with. My then professor of constitutional law, when I was here at Osgoode Hall, Erwin Kotler, and I, and one other person who were from Quebec, we went outside and we told the students who were protesting, "You have no idea what you're talking about." First of all, there were no soldiers in Toronto. They were all in Montreal and in the Ottawa area and in other parts of Quebec. But a democracy needs a way to defend itself. The War Measures Act was not adequate. We didn't have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms at that time. And eventually we evolved with a series of laws that include up to now Bill C-41 and the upcoming Bill C-51. Now, I'm a criminal defense lawyer, so there are times that I'm cynical, and there are times when I obviously have a lot of disrespect for authority. Nevertheless, I do believe in the rule of law, and I'm also a teacher. I teach, I'm an adjunct professor at Osgoode Hall, where I teach international criminal law. I was very interested to see that the quote from Josh Scheinert was one of my students. He was actually part of the team that I take annually to the International Criminal Court, where Osgoode Hall competes against some 60 countries dealing with these issues. So I don't know if I succeeded or failed with Josh. When 10 years ago, my ex-professor, Erwin Kotler, invited myself and 14 other people, one of which is here in the audience, Salma Siddiqui, to join what was called the Cross-Cultural Roundtable on National Security. 14 of the 15 members were not born in Canada. The only one who was a Chinese-Canadian by the name of Solomon Wong from Vancouver. But what we got to know is the inside of how anti-terrorism and national security legislation comes about. You can forget about the ministers. They're politicians, they come and they go. It's the deputy ministers. It's the top echelon of the bureaucrats. It's the leadership of the RCMP, CSIS, CBSA, the Canada Security Establishment, and so on, that really lead the way. And with all the cynicism that I had, I have to say that not too quickly, I realized that we actually have civil servants at the very top who very much care for Canada. and they very much care to make sure that the laws that we have are also within the concepts of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And I don't have that much time, but let me just begin. There was a time when if the police wanted to infiltrate a drug ring, they were not allowed to actually participate in drug sales. It was illegal. It went to the Supreme Court of Canada, which said the police have to be punished, unless, of course, Parliament changes the law. They've done that, and, of course, the test when you join a gang, whether it's terrorism or drugs, is you've got to be able to walk the walk and talk the talk. That's what ultimately Bill C-51 is all about. It allows CSIS to do what it's supposed to do, which is protect. And I see my time is over, so I'll cut it out now.
Thank you, Leo, for your admirable discipline. So you can see the great care for character with which our panelists were selected. So that's an interesting perspective on balancing the pillars of reference both in law and in terms of the institutions and people we entrust to enforce them. And I think with a different perspective, coming from a different background, Diane Bederman. Thank you very much for 5 minutes.
Good evening. There are approximately 7 billion people in the world, but only 43% of us live in flourishing democracies. 2012 was the 7th year in a row in which more countries lost freedoms than gained them. Why am I telling you this? To remind all of us that democracies are fragile and few and require protecting from external and internal threats. George Jonas, a columnist and author, recently wrote in the National Post, quote, "I don't like the Harper government's proposed anti-terrorism bill at all. The only thing I like less than Bill C-51 is terrorism," end quote. Terrorism is alive in Canada. Now Edmonton police are setting up a counter-terrorism unit to investigate an unprecedented number of terrorist suspects and threats. One of the most important responsibilities of our federal government is providing security and defending our freedoms, our Western culture. There was a time when we knew our enemy by the country who declared war, the uniform of the combatants, the knowledge that there were rules of engagement, and there was such a thing as an officer and a gentleman. Those days are gone. We're up against barbaric terrorists who spread fear and declare their desire to destroy Western civilization in the name of religion. Our government must respond to the new realities by modifying our security so that we can defend our liberty. In 1762, Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote the book of the Social Contract or Principles of Political Right, and I quote, "The contract essentially binds people into a community that exists for mutual preservation. In entering into civil society, people sacrifice the physical freedom of being able to do whatever they please, but they gain the civil freedom of being able to think and act rationally and morally," end quote. I think there's a grave misunderstanding of the meaning of liberty and democracy. They were never meant to be so inclusive as to permit behaviors which are morally and ethically anathema to Western culture. That would be committing suicide by democracy. I'd like to use the discussion about the niqab as a small-scale version of the difficulty we face when balancing liberty and security in a unicultural society. Those on the side of liberty say we must not let the government dictate what we wear. Some fear denying the right to wear the niqab will lead to laws infringing on religious rights, wearing a kippah, a cross, the turban. The difference, though, is the niqab is not a religious requirement. It's cultural. It symbolizes submission, oppression of women, and the idea that some people are lesser than others. Those on the side of security say we have a right to see each other. Can I help you with something? We're going to give him a moment. Those on the side of security say we have a right to see each other because we live in an open and transparent society. In Canada, trust is one of the requirements for maintaining community safety. Trust is built on the fact that we recognize we are able to see one another. It is inherent in the social contract. The contract makes it possible for our government to enact laws, balancing liberty with security to protect our democracy. Let us never forget that freedom does not give anyone the right to demand customs or rituals that weaken the very foundations of democracy. Going back to Mr. Jonas's comment, do we want Bill C-51? Probably not. Do we need it? Yes. We are facing a moral dilemma between conflicting rights and responsibilities, which is pitting liberty against security. We've seen that from the heated public discussion about a piece of clothing. French intellectual Jean-François Ravel cautioned us about the danger of complacency regarding democracy. Quote, democracy tends to ignore, even deny, threats to its existence because it loathes doing what is needed to counter them. End quote. And then one day we wake up and realize we no longer have a choice. At the very least, the discussion about Bill C-51 is forcing us to think critically about our morals, values, priorities, rights, responsibilities, our Western values. Make no mistake, they are under attack, externally and internally. We need this discussion to ensure that we continue to live securely with our liberties in a civil society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diane. Our next speaker is experienced in trying to ensure that a Canadian tradition lives on. One of Canada's great successes has been generation after generation of immigrants coming to Canada and then taking up the responsibilities and enjoying the freedoms which our Commonwealth heritage, our common law heritage entails. And with particular experience in outreach to the Muslim community, Raheel Raza has a lot of value to say. So for 5 minutes, Raheel.
Thank you. I'd like to echo Salim's thanks to the organizers for having us here tonight. As President of the Council for Muslims Facing Tomorrow, let me begin by saying that my organization supports the general drift of Bill C-51. And we are grateful to our government for taking Islamism or political Islam as a clear and present danger in the world, and specifically in Canada. We are also grateful that the government shares our concerns to, one, rationalize the sharing of security information within government. Two, have a desire to make sure that air travel is safe for passengers and not used for terrorist travel. Three, are making an attempt to limit terrorist propaganda, which is embedded in the language of political Islam and is spread through some individuals, some Islamic organizations, and some pulpits. I'm sure you are aware that this has had an extensive impact on the Canadian Muslim communities, especially our youth. And four, the government recognizes the value of disruption in countering terrorist threats. On a personal note, as an immigrant to Canada in December 1988, the only motivation to face life and harsh winters, I should add, in Canada was that we were escaping the then government of General Zia-ul-Haq in Pakistan, who was slowly shaping the same ideology that has undone Pakistan now, and unfortunately we now see the same ideology being imported into Canada. You may ask, what is that ideology? For us as Muslims loyal to Canada and holding Canadian safety and security as our top priority, we are not new to this game, and we've been keeping track of the rise of extremism in Canada for a long time. Radicalization and extremism are not always overt, and the kind of battle that we are waging today is ideological, which means it can't always be fought with weapons. This does not even begin to address the current issues posed by ISIS and how they are recruiting our children to their own cause. Let me also add that while we recognize the overarching strengths of Bill C-51, we also look at some weaknesses. I'm not a legal expert, but my work as a community advocate and activist and a basic understanding of the bill suggests this. The proposed granting to the Canadian Security Intelligence Agency, CSIS, of the power to disrupt is a challenging thing. In defense of the government, it could be said that where such powers would otherwise breach law, CSIS would first have to seek a warrant authorizing the disruption operation. However, I might suggest that the approach to gaining authority to do this might not be sufficient to guarantee appropriate limits to this technique. Therefore, it might be useful to expand the mandate of SIRC, Security Intelligence Review Committee, in order to make sure that any new departmental or agency powers have a suitable review. I would also like to point out that all government activity taking place in Canada is subject to the Canadian Constitution, notably including the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Therefore, we look to the government to tailor review and other mechanisms appropriately, as all government activity will, in the end, be subject to the ultimate test, which is the Constitution. Let me add that we would like to consider this bill to be a work in progress, and that we are therefore confident that appropriate adjustment will be made in the legislation before it becomes law. There is no doubt at all in our minds that we would like to see this bill become the law. I fully understand and appreciate that in the Western world, where our democracy is based on civil liberties, such an act might be perceived as encroaching on personal freedoms and values. However, the bottom line is that we want to keep away threats to Canada, threats that we are very familiar with. And since I have a little bit of time left, I just want to take a moment to thank the wonderful admirer of mine who brought me a pink rose. It's not my husband, and you know who you are. Thank you so much. It made my day.
Thank you, Raheel, thereby fulfilling our promise that we would bring you diverse perspectives and content. We've been hearing about the mechanics of enforcement and the issue of the threats, so we're very pleased, by way of balance and completion, to have on our panel someone who understands the world of security, threats to security, intelligence, and the military aspect of matters on our panel. That would be John Thompson. John, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. For those of you who are sort of had dinner or looking at the end of the day and getting a little drowsy, and tuning out the speakers, I can tell you I've been in this hall several times, and there are exactly 2,270 bricks missing. So give up on that right now. Now, you're always supposed to begin with a joke, and frankly, I don't know. After 30 years of studying terrorism, I really don't know very many terrorism jokes. Now, the problem, of course, in terrorism in a democratic society is that you want to leave things in the hands of your police. You don't want this to be a war-fighting exercise any more than it must be. But the police habitually, of course, are used to fight crime. So the normal reaction of police: crime exists, go investigate, lay charges, deal with it. You don't want to do that with terrorism, especially the sort of spectacular terrorism we've been seeing in the last couple of decades. Instead, you want to prevent acts of terrorism from occurring. In an immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, we reorganized our police intelligence structures in Canada in the same way a lot of other countries reorganized theirs, and by and large, we've done pretty well with it so far. If you think about attacks inside Western Europe and North America since 9/11, you've got the Madrid bombings, you've got the 7/7 bombings in London. There have been several near misses, the 21/7 bombings that didn't occur in London because the device didn't go off, the Haymarket bombing, the Times Square bombing, but those failures are also because we've also made it very hard to acquire explosives. You just cannot go buy detonators and dynamite at Canadian Tire anymore, like you could a long time ago. So our success so far has been pretty good. So why do we actually need these new laws? Well, it's part of the relationship between the terrorist and the state is that the terrorist is going to be adaptable. They will always shift their methods and try different approaches. And faced with this long catalog of failure and near misses, when you look at especially Al-Qaeda and its busy little franchises all around the world, they changed the rules. They've big, well-organized terrorism, sophisticated terrorist attacks aren't working. So what have they done? They've gone off and they've started harnessing individual approach. Most terrorist groups in the last 100 years have been embarrassed by the sort of sociopaths and psychotics who sort of embrace the cause, run out and commit homicide and say, I've done it for the revolution, I've done it because I'm an anarchist. The jihad movement embraces them and encourages them and tries to empower them. So we get what we call the lone wolf attacks. And some of these lone wolves are about as, my joke is, as Muslim as a bacon sandwich. But they still keep coming. The other side of things is that if you think back, where we're also failing, about 10 years ago, we were on the lookout for about 20 Canadian passport holders who were abroad working with the jihad movement, and that number is ramping up. It's around 80 to 90 right now, and that's the official count. In other words, the structure we set up in 2002, 2003 is overtasked. They cannot keep up with the lone wolves, and they can't keep up with the people who are going abroad. And again, the nature of the threat has changed. We are dealing with not just sort of the ideological terrorist we were all familiar with from the 1970s. We're dealing with a radical ideology that has also taken on the trappings of a religion. It's got the toolkit of both a radical ideology and the religious toolkit. And I'll be honest, I've studied terrorism for 30 years, and I've never seen any movement able to attract new people so fast as the jihad movement. And you've heard it from the director of CSIS, you've heard it from the senior officers of the RCMP, I hear it from the frontline workers. They're swamped. They cannot keep up. And so if we're to have security, if we're to continue to prevent terrorist attacks, we've actually got to find a way of changing the game. In other words, they have learned how we deal with terrorism. They're changing their approach. Now we have to shift to match. But we also have to be cognizant that in counterterrorism, one of the objectives of the terrorist is not just to commit harm and violence and revel in homicide and bloodshed and enjoy the panic and fear he induces. They also like to see us change the way we do things. They like to see our civil liberties become endangered. That's one of the first things I learned about terrorism from my old boss, Morris Tugwell, years ago. The proposition the terrorist offers is heads I win, tails you lose. So when we switch around our terrorist laws, when we look at the new techniques we'll need, be cognizant of the fact that we got to be careful not to trade something away that we don't want to lose. This is your responsibility. We go forward, and it's your job to watch closely.
Thanks very much, John. It might have been in Natural History or a magazine like that a number of years ago. There was a cartoon of a lion with a very healthy mane instructing his young cub. And he said, "The good news, my boy, is that with the law of the jungle, there are no lawyers." So with apologies to Leo or any other lawyers who may be in the room, John, those are interesting perspectives on a lawless reality that we are struggling to understand how to confront. We told ourselves in putting the panel together that we had to get a journalist. It's their job to know everything about everything. So we were lucky to get Christine Williams, who's interviewed almost everyone under the sun, and no one more fitting to wrap up what we've heard and also give a few perspectives of our own. For 5 minutes, Christine.
Well, thank you for that great introduction, and thank you for everybody joining us here tonight, as well as the organizers. Now, listening to the debate going around about Bill C-51, my first impression was that this bill was going to be a draconian bill. That is, until I read the bill myself. So, in going through it, here's what I what my opinion was. The bill, first of all, is intended to protect Canadians, giving the rising tide of terrorism, terrorist threats, aggressive online recruitments to increase homegrown jihadists, which includes psychological coercions, especially of the young, to a promise of a life of meaning, to fight this great evil of the West and of Israel. That's how it was presented. Promoted through Instagram heavily, Facebook, attractive advertising campaigns, promising the young money and gifts. Bill C-51, like the over 1,000-page criminal code, the latter of which I think most people have not read, contains checks and balances and plenty of oversight. First, by way of our Constitution and commitment to human rights. Cases can be fought all the way up to the Supreme Court. Their powers of the Governor and Council, Attorney General, and the Security Intelligence Review Committee, not to mention public scrutiny. CSIS was given authority over national security following the famed McDonald Commission into RCMP activities. CSIS does not have powers of arrest and must go through a process leading up to any such arrest as might be warranted. One of the strongest criticisms I've heard about this bill is that it risks privacy violations and puts too much power into the hands of CSIS. But what about CPIC, the Canadian Police Information Centre? What about when investigations are carried out into organized crime, requiring extensive background investigations and even police wiretaps? We live in a democracy. In our democracy, historically, there is progression along with necessary growing pains. But we do not live in a totalitarian regime. Sometimes in our democracy, violations have happened at the hands of the law enforcement, and sometimes violations by the Human Rights Commission, the very body that exists to protect our human rights. This bill is needed in an effort to confront terrorism. In so doing, it criminalizes and targets terrorism, which is on the rise, and thus begins to demystify it, molding it into something more tangible. It reduces, to some degree, the terror component. When one thinks of terrorism, one thinks of a specter, a thing that you can't put your finger on, and it makes us more terrified. This can wreak destruction upon us. This is something that hits us psychologically, and it awaits us. And we're afraid, what is the next step? What is it going to look like? It is time that we address such fears, that we address this specter, and under our national authorities. Now, when you hear detractors of this bill, you ask the question to them, well, what is the option? You don't often hear of an option. Our democracy affords us diverse opinion, which is to be praised. Open dialogue afforded by our Constitution is an affront to the very terrorist mindset. Violent Islamists, aka terrorists, want to silence and terrorize us, and they will use any means to do so, both violent and non-violent, through intimidation, accusations, and a victimology mindset. This bill is an honest effort to protect all Canadians of all creeds and of all races. But we must keep a keen eye as citizens to ensure that checks and balances are in place and that there is accountability, that we know who's accountable. This new bill puts the pressure and the onus upon CSIS as an agency to be primarily accountable.
Excellent and timely remarks all around. And Christine, in an unprecedented act of self-discipline, I think you've actually won back a minute or so that we'd run over. So I'm not sure if that's a first for this hall, but I think we can glory in it for a moment. Before we turn to the audience, where we'll have about 60 seconds apiece before the microphone goes off, I want to get the conversation started between the panelists just by asking one or two questions. And I'll start, well, there's a reference from Scripture that runs more or less, came a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. So we're talking about institutions or leaders or drafts of bills that we think may or may not be trustworthy to help achieve the ends that we're trying to meet in terms of ensuring security while preserving liberty. We did indeed hear very diverse perspectives from our 6 panelists, but 2 things that struck me was, 1, there was a lot of concrete focus on Bill C-51, so this is a magnet for this discussion, and we heard, I think, in some ways, a general convergence in terms of a willingness to take the risk, in effect, to plunge forward with legislation of this kind to ensure greater security. So I guess it falls to me by way of counterpoint to ask the general question about unintended consequences, or the double-edged sword, or who watches the watchman. So with that idea of came a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph, do any of you have any risks that if you are confident in the ways a law like this would be used now, could it fall into or be used by other parties? Christine, you finished by mentioning the abuses of administrative law by some of the human rights tribunals in Canada, so that in the hands of people that we don't trust, or people we did trust until they had more power, we get unexpected consequences that are toxic. Any of the panelists who might want to lean in on that? Leo, we'll start with you.
Well, the point is that we draft laws. We have laws under the criminal code which in fact allow the police to enter your home without you even knowing it. All they need, however, is a warrant from a judge. I almost daily cross-examine police on what's called the ITO, the information to obtain, which is the sworn affidavit that they need in order to be able to listen in on your conversations, break into your homes, seize things, put the little machinery that traces you and everything there. Can there be abuse? Absolutely. We write the laws. We hope that the people that carry them out carry it out with the proper honesty and integrity. Does it happen every time? Absolutely not. And in fact, the Toronto Star has had a series of articles about police officers who've been found to have lied in order to get the warrants. That's why we have the courts. That's why we have, with respect, defense lawyers. And that's why we need to be able to continue this openness as to what occurs. Do we succeed? Absolutely not. Not always. But we do more often than not. And I have to say that after 40 years of practicing criminal defense law, I'm actually amazed by the smallish number of police officers who abuse rather than not. So it's the trickle-down effect. The laws are passed, I think, with good intentions and good spirits, but ultimately it's the lower levels that have to carry it out, and that's where you end up with problems.
Thank you very much, Leo. And Diane, I think you wanted to weigh in?
In a flourishing democracy, we rely on our media to hold our government accountable. The problem over the past, I don't know how many decades, I think I've lost track, is our media here and throughout most of the West has moved all the time toward the left. And they now have an ideology that they use, and they use that ideology when they write their stories. We have the CBC, which is the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, who has an ideology that goes against anything from the right. If we do not have a media whose job is to see what's going on, report the facts instead of opining their narrative, we will lose our democracy. In a democracy, the fourth estate is one of the most important parts of our lives. And if we don't hold our media accountable, then no one will hold our government accountable.
Very pithy, and I think we'll hear from Christine briefly.
A big focus that we see is the potential for abuse by our police services and so forth. But I think when one looks at the Western Hemisphere and weighs the threat of a terrorism or an Islamist mindset, the worst abuse I think any of us have seen is in Rotherham in England, when 1,400 children were sexually abused, and the perpetrators, the police didn't want to touch who they were. They were described as being Muslim men. They didn't want to touch them. They didn't want to have anything to do with it. Arrests weren't made. The social services, people washed their hands clean of this, and those heinous abuses were allowed to continue because the police forces, as well as the social workers and so forth, were terrorized and terrified to deal with it.
Salim?
Yeah, Leo's comments were most helpful and interesting. I mean, what he says is indicating is that proportionately we do not have the sort of abuse by our security forces and security agencies that some people would like to suggest could or might or would happen if such and such laws are passed. I want to say this to Diane's point, but in a general statement, we are a very robust democracy. We're not going to lose it. I think I take the issue that's not the point. We're going to be 150-year-old, and I remind my students that we are one of the oldest democracy. In the period that we are going to be celebrating 150 anniversary of our democracy, the French have had 5 republics. Maybe they will be having more republics. So we have a lot to be proud of. But there is a genuine concern with the rapid development of technology. To what extent must we expose our liberty to the issue of security? To what extent, in a democracy such as ours, or in the great republic to the south of us, where this debate has opened up in the last few years, allow the state to snoop into our private lives in terms of security? I mean, I think those are very genuine concerns, and we cannot just brush it under the carpet. And so, if just 10 more seconds, I want to point out again that we make a mistake when we talk about government, and we mean only, in the classical sense, the Treasury bench. The government is not the Treasury bench, or the government is not the cabinet. The government is not simply the Prime Minister and his office. The government is the entire structure, and the political opposition has a very important role to play to keep the Treasury bench honest, to keep everybody honest, to play the robust role. And so we have to hold not only one side, that is the Treasury bench, accountable, we also have to hold all those who participate in our House of Commons, whether they are living up to the responsibility in the circumstances that we are going through.
Excellent. And I think John Thompson had a word to add.
I think it was Leo who mentioned some comments about the history of terrorism in Canada. We've had hundreds of episodes of terrorism in Canada, mostly by groups you've never even heard of. I think half of them were by the Doukhobors, if you can remember them at all. Terrorism is a very nebulous activity, and it intersects with a lot of other activities. And you have to think about it. Like, where's the point where a protest group, gets a little frisky, starts bringing rocks to demonstrations? Where do they cross over the edge? And we have minor terrorist groups like the Animal Liberation Front, who are near and dear to my heart because they tried to kill me about 20 years ago. Some of the environmental groups, things like that, well, basically, the police can handle them routinely without special powers. They're not that sophisticated. But if we have these special powers in existence, again, the chance that they might be misused or misapplied, it might be politically correct to go after the radical right, who basically most of them couldn't organize an orgy in a brothel with a credit card, but the possibility is there. So we've got to be careful about that, but I think the point that I really need some reassurance on in C-51 is that our most powerful anti-terrorism measures come into play only if you're a listed entity. In other words, if you're just a bunch of rioters who got carried away and decide to the next riot you're going to commit deliberate violence, these laws won't apply to you. But if you belong to a listed terrorist group that we all know about, then they will. And I need to see that protection still there.
it would be very awkward if I didn't say anything. Everyone has. So let me just put in my 2 bits. I'll follow up on what Salim said to say that the checks and balances are we the people, the citizens of this great country where we have a voice, we have a choice, and we have a vote. So we will be the checks and balances and make sure that it is done properly. And I think this is part of that discussion right here. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a brilliant segue, actually, to the last question that I would ask before we open it up to the floor. There is obviously a sense that the threat is understood, but the proper response and where it comes from is still being formulated. And so, there's a famous joke that democracy is 3 wolves and 2 sheep voting on what's for dinner. And some of the remarks that we've heard from our panelists remind us that a civil society is not identical with government, and a democracy is not the same as a civil society. You can have, there are places where strongmen nominally get 99% of the vote, and they always call themselves democracies. So what's the underlying difference that makes for a robust and free society? 2 things that I didn't hear from the panelists, and they may come from the floor, but without hoping to preempt, there's a question of the wide net. In the United States, the suspicion that wasn't there in the reaction to 9/11 has arisen. They're doing exactly the opposite of what the Israelis do. Instead of going after the bomb, they go after the man in Israel. In the United States, the NSA goes after everyone. So there's a question of the wide net. Who will feel, in effect, the brunt of a lurch towards stronger security measures. And then there's also a question of the intercept point. I mean, we are talking about preventative policing, but we're talking about it in our own streets and in our own society. And I think there is a question, how did these people get here, if they're such bad actors? And how did they get up to the very moment of being ready to commit violence if we have a strong democracy, if we have a watchful public? In Israel, their intercept point is now down to the Iron Dome. A rocket is already hanging overhead when it gets shot down. That's very late in the game. So did either of you have any comments on the wide net or the intercept point?
Let me just say, and I agree with John about the terrorism in Canada. The difference that we now have is the difference between what was sort of small-time domestic terrorism and now the internationalization of terrorism, which actually began in the early 1970s with the hijacking and with bombing of airplanes and the attacks that occurred there. If you stop and think about it, the IRA may have gone fundraising in the Americas, but they never exported their terrorism. Even the Tamil Tigers never exported their terrorism. They wanted your money, and they came across that way. The exportization and the internationalization of terrorism began with the attacks on Israeli airplane and Israeli aircraft in the early 1970s, and which led to the Lydda Airport massacre and other matters. So the intersection, and it's the same thing with the recruitment. The recruitment of our young is based primarily on social media. It is not necessarily based on social media in Canada. It can be anywhere. And the connections that occur, the attraction, the fact that you go from a video game of shooting aliens to, hey, why don't we do this for real? That's part of the attraction that occurs, and quite frankly, that's part of the necessity of C-51 is to try to coordinate things a lot more to allow for the sharing of information. Right now, despite CPIC, you can't share that necessarily with every agency. C-51 is just going to make everything seamless so that you will. We need that simply because the terrorists that we face today are internationally based. They are very sophisticated, very suave. It's mind-boggling to me, but apparently it's understandable to the psychologists that ISIS can behead people and all of a sudden there's a rush of recruits who want to join it. So I think we have to understand that the terrorism that we had in Canada is definitely changing, and we need new techniques.
Thank you very much. And I think Salim had his hand up next.
Well, something I hope will be discussed. I just want to let the cat, or what is the cat out into the pigeon, if that's the saying. I think once we start degrading our language, we lose the sense of what we're talking about. And if there is a flaw in Bill C-51, which is a very big flaw, it doesn't define terror and terrorism. Who is doing it, where it is coming from, what are they focusing on. It is left implicit, you know. And this is where the problem has been since 9/11, if we go back to, and as Raheel said, you know, the buck stops with us. It is the people, and it is we who are the ultimate checks and balance. And when we refuse not to seriously question and see where the problem lies, that is, in a sense, to profile the problem, we lost it. When an 80-year-old woman on a wheelchair has to be frisked going through our airports, then we lost it. And so the complaint that I was alluding to, which is what Edward Snowden and others are talking about, what extent that the state will snoop into the private lives of our citizens, which is about, you know, NSA, New York Times story recently about government tapping into our private conversation and so on and so forth, because the technology is there. We lost it because we, the people, said that we will not tolerate profiling. In other words, you know, it is the culture that has evolved over the last 40, 50 years, which we don't talk about it as we should talk about it vigorously, is where has multiculturalism brought us to in terms of a political correctness, that we cannot speak openly to each other, frankly to each other, without being targeted for being bigots or worse.
Go to John first. Very thought-provoking, and the hands are going up, so I'll go to John next.
I guess the guidebook, or the best guidebook on actually asking people why someone gets involved in terrorism is that thin little book from 1952, Eric Hoffer's The True Believer, and if you haven't read it, please do so. But the main point about someone who gets involved in terrorism is it's someone who's actually yearning to transform themselves, to become more exciting, more dynamic than they are in their ordinary drab little lives. Terrorist ideologies always have a powerful attraction, especially to the young, to the listless, to the restless. Most of us, maybe we even flirted with, you know, some mass movement at some time, thought better of it. You know, when I was 15, I was in the attracted to socialism. When I was 17, I joined the army. I got over that phase really fast. But the main thing is that the way terrorists are recruited is that the packages are out there for that listless person who's looking for a more heroic self-identity, who wants to be sort of the great figure of history. And this is the way that the Nazis appealed. This is the way the Marxists appealed, that you take the ordinary person and they transform themselves into something greater by submerging themselves into the ideology. And it's very attractive for a lot of people. Our problem is that almost all of us touch on that stage at one point or another in our lives, especially when we're young. It's like a virus that infects the whole of the body politic, and we have to pick out the infected before they become dangerous. And here is the other problem, of course, is now the transmission of that infection is over the internet. So actually, we hate the intrusiveness of these intelligence agencies that are watching all these websites, intercepting all these communications, but that's our public health system, and I hate it, but that's the one we've got right now. How do we pick out these people, these 1 or 2 in every million who are about to start acting up this way, unless actually we're intercepting communications and monitoring them? This is a very, very thorny issue, but if we don't do this, we'll get surprised and hurt a lot.
I'll go to... Thank you very much. I'll turn briefly to Raheel.
Brief. I'm going to come back to what I said first, that when we look at the larger issue of security and safety in Canada, each one of us is also responsible for seeing what is happening at a very, very grassroots level. A law by itself may not be enough. We have to ask the bigger question, which nobody is talking about, is how are these young people recruited? Right here on the ground. They're recruited towards terrorism through hate. And where does this hate propaganda come from? It is coming from religious institutions, and we are not questioning that. When you have an Al-Quds festival being held at Queen's Park, which is nothing more than a hate fest, then I think each one of us has a question to ask. Why is hate being propagated? Why is hate being allowed? Because it is also this hate that allows the other to become a victim of terrorism. So we must stop the hate.
Thank you very much. And Christine?
I'd like to pick up, Raheel, what she's saying about the hate. First of all, I think as a society we need to do a lot of introspection because political correctness has gone too far, but we also need to look at how we feel toward our fellow brothers and sisters in the human race. We cannot brand, we cannot afford as a society to be branding all Muslims with the same brush, painting them with the same brush, looking at all Muslims and saying they're going to be Islamists. We need to make that separation from the Raheels and Salims of the world, from those who truly seek to destroy us. I'll give you one quick example. This guy's name is Muhammad Abdurrahman. He worked with the International Institute for Islamic Thought. He was there when the word Islamophobia was conceived, and he said it was actually created. He's since left that institute. It was created for the purpose of, and this is what he says, it's nothing but a thought-terminating cliche to beat down critics. It has become so that our society, Western society, is being, a lesser version of Pakistan, where we're starting to look as if we are considering blasphemy laws. We cannot legitimately criticize Islam because we're afraid to do so. We have sins of the past against every race in the book. In fact, other races have sins against other races too, like the Japanese and the Chinese, and the list goes on. But we have progressed as a society. We are truly sorry as a joint entity of the sins of the past. We're a multicultural dynamic now where all races live here, and the common good and the common goal is that we could all live in peace with one another and not give in, and that's the challenge, not give in to special interest groups. So to look after and balance our human rights and do it without apology, but at the same time, look after our security and care about our fellow man. So it does require, I think, a lot of introspection as to how we feel as a citizen of Canada and of the West.
Thank you, Christine. And now Diane.
I'd like to suggest that if Pierre Elliott Trudeau were here today, he would take back his statement of multiculturalism. It's a misnomer. I think if he were here today, he would say we are unicultural, multi-ethnic. Western civilization is based on an ethic where everyone is born with equal intrinsic value. We have free will, and you have to learn free will. We wake up with it, and we think everyone has it, but we don't. And we've also learned something that came out of the desert 3,500 years ago. You will care for the other the way you care for your brother. It was revolutionary then. It is still revolutionary today. Western culture differs from Islamic or Eastern culture, what's going on even in India and China, because, for instance, in Islamic culture, there isn't the idea that everyone has equal intrinsic value. Some are lesser than others. Women are lesser than. The concept of their basic foundation of their culture is submission compared to our free will. And they still live in a system of tribal cultures where one tribe kills another. Until cultures can accept others as equals, you will have tribal culture. Western culture, we fight here for all people to be looked upon as equal intrinsic value. When we lose that, we will lose Western culture. Canada is a unicultural country, multi-ethnic.
Thank you once again to all of our articulate panelists. This is a public conversation, so it's high time we turn to the public. What we will do is, in the first instance, ask you by way of reminder to think of filling out briefly the short survey on the back of your brochure. That way we can make the next event even more engaging than this one. What we will do is have people advance to the podia on either side here. We'll alternate from the one to the other. And what you'll do is, when you get there, you press the little green and red button, and your mic will go live for 60 seconds plus a very short grace period, and the mic will go off, and then we'll look for responses from any panelists you've addressed or others who might want to add. That'll take a couple of minutes per question, and we hope to get through as many of you as possible. If there is someone who is unable to make it to the podium, we do have a wireless mic. Our friend Matthew Sheedy had volunteered kindly to take the wireless mic to those who can't make it to the podium. But to begin with, we'll go back and forth from side to side. So at my right, of course, your left, more importantly, if you just press the button, we'd love to hear your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I have...
Oh, or statement, you're right.
Okay,
you're right.
Statement. While the speakers were speaking, I wrote down quite a few points and I don't even know where to start. So I'm going to begin by defining myself. I don't see a lot of people in the audience who look like me, so that concerns me. I'm born in Toronto, homegrown. I'm going to use that term to define myself right now. Daughter of Pakistani immigrants who came to Canada in the 1960s when people of color were allowed to come to Canada. They weren't allowed to come before that. I felt like putting on this scarf over my head and covering my mouth when you guys were speaking. And I feel like all the panelists are representing the same side. It's not, I don't know. So I'm just going to go through a couple of points. For the point about the police force in England being terrified of addressing Muslims who had abused children, what about the Catholic Church and how they've abused children and how that was brushed under the table?
So I would ask you, I mean, one conversation at a time, please. So we'll hear from the speaker for a few more seconds.
It was, and it was.
No problem. We'd like to hear the rest of your question to the speaker. And
it's heinous regardless of who does it. It should not be identified with one group. When religious groups do it, powerful groups do it, like the church, it does get swept under the carpet. Adults would not have come forward. Children didn't have a voice. As adults, they had a voice, and that's how people found out. That's how that was exposed.
Thank you very much.
This is a black and white fact. I'm not making this one up. I read it in the paper. Number two.
Thank you very much.
Oh, interesting. Right. The media. Interesting. Yeah, right. The media, and also talk to...
So, young lady, sorry, because we're coming up on 2 minutes rather than one, you've posed a good challenge. I think a number of our panelists might want to answer it, and I think that there's some interesting comments from the perspective of identity politics, things that we... We'll take a question from the other podium, and then we'll break both questions, or both sets of questions, to the panelists.
Okay, hello everyone. So my name is Athar Khan. I'm someone who was a former Salafist. I'm also someone who is a former leftist. I'm someone who's been a political commentator for a while now, speaking about these issues. I've also been on the board of the Muslim Consultative Committee of the Toronto Police for about 3 years, working within the Muslim community, trying to build bridges between the police and the Muslim community. Yes, I speak out a lot of these issues, and I agree with much of what was said here today. And just to pin down on one particular thing, I agree completely with Raheel when she said we must stop the hate, and no one understands the degree to which this hate exists, right? There's a systematic demonization of non-Muslims in the Muslim community, particularly mosques, Islamic schools, Muslim student associations. Now, we have to, of course, keep in mind that there's a lot of Muslims who don't go to any of these things, who don't go to mosques or Muslim student associations or Islamic schools. But we have to target these things, like I believe Salim Mansur was saying, with regard to profiling, or at least targeting specific areas or communities and where the problem exists. So I think we need to get in there, and we need to try to bring in voices such as Raheel, such as Salim Mansur, such as myself, and other reformist Muslim voices that say, no, you know what? Non-Muslims aren't bad people. I can make friends with Jews and Christians and present that counter-narrative, and we need the help of the Canadian society and the media to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. At this point, we've had two questions, two very different perspectives. I'd like to throw it open to the panelists for responses.
Can I,
by all means.
I'm sorry that the lady left, because, no, please.
Please hear him out.
We're here to hear everybody out, because what I would have said to her is, and this is something that Jim Judd, the former head of CSIS, said, and it may be that Salma may remember that meeting. There was an objection by one of the members of our security committee to the emphasis, if you will, on Muslims. And the answer that he gave was this: when the FLQ crisis arose, because it was the French Canadians or the Quebecois that took credit, we concentrated on them and we went after them. When the Air India bombing occurred, it was the Sikhs who took credit and we concentrated on them. When 9/11 occurred and subsequent matters, it was the Muslims who took credit, and so we're going after them. If you can tell me, and you have some evidence, that it's really the Norwegians who are behind this, I'll be happy to investigate them then. Now, that's the point where we are today. We're not facing the Doukhobors anymore. We're not facing the FLQ anymore. We're not facing the Sikhs anymore, at least not in Canada. And this is the problem that we have. The problem is also, of course, there is, 1.7 billion Muslims in the world. They are obviously a very powerful group. And I think, and I can't remember who said, we're not to tar everyone with the same brush. And we shouldn't. That's absolutely correct. And the point that the young man made about trying to work together, or some of the other groups that are there, we need to learn to differentiate. And that's absolutely true. We need to learn to differentiate between those who seek to undermine us and to cause havoc, and those who are not, although they obviously have a right to object, to protest against various policies and so on. So I think a little more tolerance, if you will, is what I think she was originally asking for before she went into a greater or a different situation.
Different tangent, yeah. Any other quick responses to our first two questions, and then we'll go back to the floor.
Thank you, Leo. I would have also responded to the young lady had she stayed by first saying that she didn't identify herself. She should have given her name. And secondly, her starting off by saying that she doesn't see any people like herself. She must be colorblind. If she, I mean, hello? So this victim ideology is not something that's appreciated. I'm brown, I'm Muslim, I wear a nose ring. So let's get on with it.
So that's an interesting, it goes back to Diane's point about the distinction between multi-ethnic and multicultural. I mean, there is a Canadian culture, presumably it calls us to treat everyone equally, but we're going to look and be different underneath that umbrella of equality. Are there other quick comments before we move on to the floor? Christine?
Just one quick comment, because I think the lady that was speaking there is a real teaching moment. As Raheel said, there are many people in this room that are what is typically referred to as visible minorities. The other thing that she said is we all seem to be on the same page. Right before she went up, I remembered saying specifically that we cannot afford as a nation to paint all Muslims with the same brush. So it was selective hearing as well. We also have to be very careful about the victimology mindset, because within some of that is truth, but a lot of it is not. She even referred to history, bringing up the Catholic abuses. That has been long dealt with, and it still happens today among any group for that matter. But what the difference is, the Rotherham, it was a widespread scandal. People were terrified to say anything. It wasn't even a situation of just, okay, let's just sweep it under the carpet. The police, the law enforcement, the social workers, they were all afraid to deal with it. We as a nation have come so far, the West has come far, there are past sins, but there comes a time where you have to stop apologizing, right the wrongs, and move forward. And I think that time has come now.
And I think, thank you very much. And we can go at this point back to the podium on the left and we hear the next question.
Is it on?
I think so.
Yes, my name is Tahir Gora. I'm from Canadian Thinkers Forum. As we know that any potential Islamist terrorism stems out from a certain jihadi Sharia mindset that prevails within Canadian Muslim, within 1 million Canadian Muslims. So my question to panelists, particularly Professor Salim Mansur, that how could we change that particular jihadi mindset without engaging over 1 million Canadian Muslims?
How can we target the threats without enraging or unnecessarily profiling or targeting 1 million Canadian Muslims, for example?
Well, I'm not aware of, since 9/11 at least, that, any part of the government or anyone has targeted the entire 1 million and growing body of Muslim. The word discrimination or selecting or understanding, I would say profiling, we have dropped it. And therefore we are reluctant to speak about the very specific groups where we need to target. And I would advocate, or I've been arguing, that we should become far more intelligent about a culture today, I'm talking about, not about the past, today, a culture that is going through an immense upheaval and implosion of which terrorism is a symptom. We need to become far more intelligent, aware, and open to talk about it, so that the Muslim can talk about it. By the way, the Muslims are the biggest and the largest numbers of victims of Muslim terrorism. Muslims have faced genocide from Muslim governments. And yet here we are in Canada, an open, liberal, democratic society, and we have put gags on ourselves that we don't want to talk about it. And those of us who do want to talk about it, we are censored.
Very good. We can go to the other microphone.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
My name is Howard Rotberg. I'm a writer, retired lawyer. I'm a publisher. I'm honored to publish Salim's latest award-winning book, Delectable Lie, and a really exciting upcoming book by Diane Bederman called Back to the Ethic.
Excellent plug.
I'm really, as a retired lawyer, I'm into the justice system, I'm into the legislation, and I think it's been adequately put in perspective that anytime we take a legislative approach to a problem, we have to have layers of oversight, etc. And the problem that I've been dealing with for the last 12 or 13 years is I've been down in the trenches in this war over our values. And make no mistake about it, it is a war, and it's over our values. And therefore, I think it was Christine who pointed out problems in the media. We have problems in the police forces, like we've seen in England, where they won't take on Muslims if they're doing certain crimes. So we have a problem in media. We also have a problem in police. If they're given a certain tool to use and they will not use it because they think tolerance is more important than justice, we have a major problem. So I write a lot about tolerance and what is the extent of tolerance, and about our cultural relativism, our political correctness, our moral equivalency. And when Leo mentioned the woman was calling out for tolerance, we have to be very, very careful about people who are selectively tolerant and people who don't want, who want to tolerate that which is so intolerant that it could well have people take over our society who want to end all tolerance. So I just want to just address to the panel the question I really have.
Sorry, I think we at just about 2 minutes. We're well into that. John, I think, wanted to comment on tolerance, the tolerable and the intolerable.
If I can. The issue is not just media and the police force. The issue is our universities. The universities, I gave back my degrees from University of Toronto in history and in law because they have something, an anti-Israel, anti-Jewish hate fest called Israel Apartheid Week, and they said it's about steering a middle course between different opinions. And I think the universities, our media, and also our non-governmental organizations, including our own Jewish organizations, who have betrayed.
Thank you very much, John. I think you had some comments.
Tolerance is, again, one of the issues I've been thinking about a lot in the last little while, and the way I think of it, the way it has to be, is that tolerance is a form of credit. It's an advance payment against the exchange of respect. And if you don't get respect back after a while, you cut that payment off. You do not tolerate the intolerant. But this is actually the other critical battle now for all of you, is not just to understand what's in our terrorist legislation and watch it very carefully. It's also to be heard from when you start seeing some of the forms of intolerance, like the intolerance that our last questioner was subjected to. When you get a educational institute, subsidizing what I call Jew Hate Week, and they call it something else, or some of the other forms that we're seeing, get after it. Go after it. Do not hesitate to mock people who overuse tolerance. Get out there in the public arena when someone says, "Oh no, we got to tolerate this," because no, you don't. You have to know what your values are and be prepared to ruthlessly defend them. And that's part of your responsibility as well.
Thank you very much. And we'll go back to the lady on this podium.
Okay, my name is Sharon Isaac. I'm just a citizen, Scarborough citizen, and semi-retired, and also a member of the little grassroots group called Canadian Patriotic Society. I have a couple of great fears, actually. One relates to the ability of the police, and I'd like to have some assurance through my own personal experience and some of the others. Like, I'm not so sure. I'd like to know how Mr. Adler or Mr. Thompson feel about our Toronto police having the power to not only arrest, but also lay charges without the agreement, permission of the Attorney General. So that, and when I see also the political correctness seen in the police officers who are actually there to uphold it all, that really concerns me. Okay, so that's one. And number two, it's not related, but this fear I have is, Raheel mentioned hate in what we see in Al-Quds Day that takes place on Queen's Park. And I've been there 3 times, and I've seen thousands of their Muslims, supporters of Ayatollah Khomeini, and I see them. And there's a lot of hate there, hate preachers, and some supporters. And I also see people like Raheel, people like Salim, and others. When you call a gathering, I don't see too many people, so that concerns me. When you said, somebody said, Mr. Adler said, 1.7 billion, that is kind of frightening for me in that regard. And what I'm afraid we're seeing maybe through this global terrorism is this it is religious. The hatred comes from the religious belief. Therefore, is it You can argue it is Islam, it isn't Islam, that can be debated, but there's no question that terrorists, they believe, in their version of Islam. So my question is it religious reformation that's happening? And if that's the case, and what chances do we have? And I'm afraid it's going to be very, very bloody with any religious war.
Thank you very much. So some questions there to Leo first and also to John.
You've actually touched on a bit of a problem. Our criminal code is divided into a very, very small group of charges that do need the approval of the Attorney General. Hate charges are one of them. And then the rest is left up to the police. Except, you see, in Western Canada, they do things opposite. The police there do not have the right. They have the right to arrest everywhere in Canada. You can do a citizen's arrest, too, if you have reasonable and probable grounds. But leaving aside the arrest, the decision of the charges in Western Canada is left up to the Crown attorneys, who get involved right away. And I can tell you, as a result, there's a lot less garbage in the courts there than there are over here. For whatever reason, in Ontario and in Quebec, the tradition has been that the police not only investigate, not only arrest, but also charge. In theory, this is then supposed to be reviewed by the Crown. I can tell you it's some student or some clerk who simply checks it off, and that's a problem that's been outstanding for a long time. Maybe one day we'll get over it.
And John, very quickly.
I guess some of the most heroic examples we've seen in the past are what one or two individuals can do. And the whole question about religion, I mean, Islam is a big tent. It's a huge tent, and it's got a lot of different cultures in it. But also there's a question of interpretation. I mean, I'm a Catholic. I belong to a church that in the past used to execute gay people, used to burn witches, and think of some of the other fun things we did, including cleaning out Spain at one point or another. But on the other hand, religions change. And actually that's one of the things I've been watching in Islam now. Now that Iranians have seen what the mullahs are like when they actually form a government, there's a lot of Iranians who are thinking maybe we shouldn't quite be so Islamic. The other thing is you look at how liberal the Islamic world was in many ways until Saudi oil money started to fund Salafists left, right, and center. That's maybe the group we have to address, is go after the Salafists and think of them as a political ideology and leave the rest of the religion alone. But also there's been some early warning signs in the last little while, including Al-Sisi in Egypt, who basically went and talked to the nation's clerics and went, shut up, clean up your act, you're getting us all in trouble. If there's going to be an Islam in the future, it'll be if you guys amend your ways. And you're starting to look at some of the other Arab world going after Daesh and ISIS and realizing, oh my God, the problem is out of control. We've got to handle them. So I think Islam has actually got the potential more now than any time in the last 40 years to start to really reform itself.
Excellent. And now I have to advise you that with our cutoff time looming, we will move into lightning round. We'll go from podium to podium. I invite you to ask or state your perspective in 30 seconds or so. We'll go back and forth, and then there'll be a bunch of nuggets of great wealth for the panelists to respond to. Please.
Hi, my name is Morgan, and I'm an atheist and a secularist. And my question is naturally coming from that perspective. And that's, how do we deal with a religious issue like Islamist terrorists, which is a plausible interpretation of the religion, when Canada itself has so much religion built into its law? For instance, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which we talked about a number of times, has God's supremacy mentioned in it. We do have a blasphemy law, which hasn't been used, but it's still there, and a number of other relatable things like that.
Good question. Good different perspective we haven't heard before. And to the other podium.
Yeah, I'm going to ask a question about cultural Marxism. I'd like to hear from Salim and the rest of the panel on the influence of cultural Marxism in the universities and how that's influenced the thinking that we saw tonight even.
Excellent. At this pace, we may be able to get 4 questions in. To the other podium.
My name is Ruth Cameron. I'm a member of the SAG committee, so I'm saying that. Besides the name, my name is Cameron. I'm half Doukhobor. I haven't heard them mentioned in about 40 years. But when they were burning each other's houses down, I thought that it backed up with what one of the people said about the fact they were mostly fighting with each other. And somebody mentioned Muslims in mosques and so on, trying to influence other Muslims. And the other point I wanted to say was what Salim said. More information is useful. When I was a kid and they made fun of my grandparents who were not radical, I would explain to them all about what this religion was about. And as I used to say to other people, I get rid of them because they're bored and they don't want to listen to me. So, and I guess the last point, I'm not sure it's a question, because there weren't that many Doukhobors, but these things do die down in Canada, so maybe this one will.
Okay. And to the other podium?
I need a minute because I'm from Ottawa, so you should give me more time, okay?
It's not my decision at this point. We're literally running out of time, so please let her rip.
So I just wanted to announce here, I'm the president of Coalition of Progressive Canadian Muslim Organizations. And the fact, the last lady, I'm sorry I didn't get your name, Christine, we are working with communities. Leo Adler had challenged me maybe 10 years ago about wondering whether I know about the Holocaust. Being a Muslim, I was annoyed at that, but I do know about the Holocaust. We are the first Muslim organization who are going to be doing a fundraiser, symbolic fundraiser for the monument. And we want all of you to support us because we all have to work together.
Yeah, I think so. And for about 15 seconds, one more time from the other podium.
As a retired teacher from the public system, I'm not only concerned about universities, but public schools. Not only those that are secular, but especially those that aren't. But I'd like to see advocation, like a lot of advocacy for rights and responsibilities of democracies taught to all children from outside organizations in the school. And I'd like to see it mandatory.
Wonderful. Teaching civics in a civil society. That's a great note to end. No public discussion could possibly be complete without a mention of atheist secular humanism, cultural Marxism, Doukhobors, internecine Islamic violence, and public schools. So I'll ask all of our panelists to weigh in for about 15, 20 seconds apiece on whatever caught their fancy the most from what we heard. Go ahead.
I think there was an interesting point that was expressed about being an atheist. The first point is for when we're dealing with any kind of a problem, anybody's dealing with one, it's important to understand what the target is, what the goal is. The first thing that I think everyone will benefit from, no matter what religion you are, what race you are, is to read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that every nation signed on to. And that gives us a focus of human rights and what we espouse. And it needs to be defended.
Thanks. And John? Oh, good pass. That's excellent. Raheel, sorry.
In response to the public school, I think it's a very important point to mention that one of the factors that should weigh in is the separation of church and state. And so public schools are a secular institution, and either every religion should be taught or no religion should be taught.
Diane?
There's a difference between religion and its dogma and the ethic. Canada, as are all Western democracies, are founded on ethical monotheism, which morphed into Judeo-Christian ethic. You don't have to be Christian or Jewish to participate in these countries, because the ethic, as I said earlier, teaches that all of us have equal intrinsic value. We all must practice free will, and we must care for the other. When people start talking about religion as being the cause of all our problems, they're talking about dogma. Our country is based on the idea of giving us this ethic that teaches us to care for each other. So we'd have to start leaving the concept of God out of the topic. But Canada is based on ethical monotheism, and we need to teach that to our kids.
Thank you, Diane. And Leo?
When I was in university studying political science, my professor, when he was confronted with cultural Marxism, said, it's got to be Maoism, the ongoing, everlasting revolution, which is the only way to evolve. Look at China, the most capitalist country now in the world. Schools, absolutely mandatory civics. I don't care if it's a private school, a public school, a religious-based school, whatever. There has to be an absolute standard of education, at least on that aspect.
And to close out, Salim?
The big elephant in the room is, of course, the Middle East, Islam, Islamism, Muslims, so on and so forth. And I just want to, in the 30 seconds that I have, point out that people have been talking about, at least since 9/11, that Islam needs a reform, Muslim needs to be reformed, so on and so forth. Well, my friends, the Reformation is going on right in front of our eyes. Reformation and reform is not a dinner party. It is bloody, it is ugly, it is not a straight line. The current issue of Foreign Affairs has a wonderful essay which will be very useful for me to give it to my students because, you know, they don't want to listen to what I tell them. So I would recommend all of you to read it. This is in the current issue, May-June issue of Foreign Affairs by a historian and a diplomat, John Owen, and the title is wonderful. It says, From Calvin to the Caliphate. And he's asking the people to recognize that it took 400 years for the West, that is Christendom, to go from burning people on stake to sitting here and discussing, and it's still not over. Still the process. The world of Islam is going through it right now. If you want a picture of what has happened in the past, we can see the world of Islam to see what happened in the past. And that's what we are caught up with. And that's where the question of our security comes in, because Canada cannot be insulated from the world. So the upheaval, that is the great reformation that is going on. Just 5 seconds. 2 years from now, we're not only going to celebrate 150th anniversary of Canada, we will also be marking the 500th anniversary of the year when Martin Luther penned the 95 Thesis. 500 years.
Thank you, Salim. I don't think anyone thought we would wind up the night by selling 15 or 16 additional subscriptions to Foreign Affairs, but there you have it. We're left only with enough time for one quick word of apology. We're sorry, because the building has to be closed, that we didn't get to hear from everyone who wanted to speak or who wanted to speak longer. We were simply constrained by time, and we sought to be democratic. Thanks to everyone for coming out. Thanks to our panelists. Thanks to Just Right Media for recording the event, for SUF for providing expertise on AV, and for our security people. And thanks for the organizations that presented this. We look forward to seeing you at the next event in our series. Get home safely, please.